Hello and welcome back to week 2 of the Live Low Histamine Well course. I'm so happy you're back and sticking with this journey of trying to address your histamine intolerance, getting to the bottom of your symptoms and understanding which foods are good for you and which are not. Just as a quick reminder before we get started, my name is Marie Glazer and I'm a nutritionist specializing in gut health. I help people with unexplained food intolerances get to the bottom of those so that they can feel in control of their health and comfortable in their bodies. I have a background in psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, and mindfulness, as well as a Master of Science in Nutritional Therapy, and so I combine those skills in all of my work. Today we're going to just do a quick recap of what histamine is, so hopefully you've seen last week's video and you have some idea, but we'll just recap that quickly before we get started. And then we're going to be talking about where is histamine found in food. So we're really focusing on your diet this week. Then we'll talk a bit more about how you navigate a low histamine diet, what it is, how long do you have to do it for, how do you know it's working, all these kinds of things. And I'll be sharing my tips about buying, storing, and cooking foods for a low histamine diet and some practical tips as well. And then at the end, we'll cover your tasks for this week. And I'll quickly show you this week's meal plan and recipes as well, to hopefully answer any questions before they come up. But as with anything else, if you have any questions after this video, after looking at the meal plan or the handouts or the questionnaires, just write to me on Practice Better and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So like I mentioned last time, histamine is a biogenic amine, which the body uses as a messenger. It's produced by the body to be a messenger. It's produced by bacteria, and it's also found in the foods that we eat. It's involved in those anaphylactic shock reactions, so when we have a really severe histamine reaction because we're allergic or because we have a very, very high amount of histamine, then we get those anaphylactic shock reactions. And in lower doses, we have these allergy-like symptoms that I mentioned last time. So anything where it seems like your body's trying to get rid of something, runny nose, mucus, phlegm, scratching, diarrhea, bowel movements, anything like that, is histamine's action trying to get whatever it's perceiving as this trigger out of our body. So foods can be a source of a histamine. So a food can itself have a high histamine content. For example, fish has very high histamine. Foods can be histamine liberators, which means that once they're in our body, they send signals that cause our bodies to release histamine. So they're liberating the histamine in our system. And they can block diamine oxidase, DAO, which is the enzyme that our body produces to break down histamine, particularly in the gut. So we also have the other enzyme, HNMT, which I mentioned last time, which breaks down histamine in other areas like the brain. But in the gut, it's primarily DAO. Which is also why some people with histamine intolerance are recommended or prescribed Dowsin, which is a supplement. So that's supposed to kind of make up for that lack of DAO that our own bodies have and break down histamine a bit faster for us. But there are some foods which can block the action of this diamine oxidase, making it less effective. Now, where is histamine found? So these are foods that are high in histamine themselves. So like I mentioned before, fish, some sorts of fish are just generally high in histamine, like tuna, mackerel, sardines, herring. But the older fish is, the more histamine it also builds up. And in fish, it happens really, really fast. So that's why I always recommend that if you're eating fish, you should buy it frozen, because then what normally happens is it's fished and right on the boat it's frozen. So there's very little time between the fish dying and the fish being frozen, and then it comes to you and you cook it and you eat it straight away. So there's very little time for that histamine to build up. In all other situations, fish generally tends to be quite high in histamine and it's quite likely to cause symptoms. So the other groups of foods that cause histamine symptoms are your aged foods. So let me just get my pointer out. So you have your aged foods, pickled foods, fermented foods, yeast-containing foods. So an easy way to remember that is anything that has been aged in any way. So either by pickling, fermenting, or by letting it rise for a while, or by just storing it. Anything like that is where the histamine has time to develop. So whenever you have a food that is old or produced through an aging process, you will have a lot of histamine. Fresh foods that have a lot of histamine are the fish and seafood that I already mentioned, but also nightshades, And then we have some other very random ones. So this is easy to remember. You have aged foods, you have fish and seafood, you have nightshades, which are a particular type of fruit and vegetable, and common examples are tomatoes, aubergine, chili, and paprika. But then you have this other category, and that's a bit more random. So we have avocado, spinach, banana, raspberries, and pork there. So that's just those 5 foods you'll probably have to remember individually, but otherwise you can use this rule of thumb. One exception in the nightshades group is that it seems like sweet pepper or sweet paprika or bell peppers don't seem to have that much histamine and don't seem to cause a problem for people with histamine intolerance. So those are included in the recipes in the next couple of weeks, but you'll know best if you react to those or not. What foods trigger histamine release? So those were the high histamine foods. Then we also have some foods that trigger histamine release in the body. So the food itself doesn't have a lot of histamine necessarily, but when we've eaten it, suddenly our body starts to produce more histamine, so we might have a reaction after all. So those categories tend to be citrus fruits, your beans and legumes, nuts and seeds like walnuts, cashews, and sunflower seeds, but there are exceptions. So there are low histamine options, which you will see on your handout of low histamine foods. Cumin, mustard, and pepper tend to cause histamine release. And then we've got kiwi, strawberry, papaya, pineapple, and pork. Again, I've tried to make it as kind of easy to remember as possible by making categories, but actually it's just citrus fruit and legumes that, except for mung beans, this one exception here, tend to cause histamine release. But here, these nuts, herbs, and other, you're gonna have to remember as well. And at the beginning, that can feel really overwhelming, like how am I ever going to know which foods I can eat? But actually, it becomes really easy, and it's actually not that many foods if we think about the whole list of foods that are available to us. So these foods release histamine. And then we have foods that block DAO production. So we have green tea, black tea, matcha tea, and all types of alcohol. So in my personal case, I really tend to react to these DAO blockers. My histamine intolerance is caused by a genetic mutation, which means that I don't produce a lot of DAO. And so when my DAO function is blocked even more, that's when I really start to feel symptoms. So if I have black tea, I instantly notice my symptoms flaring up. What's important to note is that many preservatives and food additives can also liberate histamine or block DAO. So if you're choosing foods to buy in the supermarket, you're kind of trying to go for the freshest possible, preferably frozen, not tinned or canned or anything like that. And then you want that list of ingredients to be really short, because preservatives and additives are very likely to cause symptoms for people with histamine intolerance. Now, the histamine bucket. If any of you have known you have histamine intolerance for long, and you've done some reading and you've done some research, you probably already know about the histamine bucket. But for anyone that doesn't, all of us can think of our bodies as a sort of bucket, the histamine bucket. And in everybody's bucket, there is some histamine. So like I said last time, histamine is important. Our body needs it. We can't live without it. So there will always be some histamine. All food has a little bit of histamine. So whatever you eat, there's always going to be some kind of histamine reaction. And that's all fine as long as your histamine isn't overflowing. So while you have just a little bit of histamine in your bucket, your body can use DAO and HNMT to degrade that histamine to keep the levels below that symptom threshold. You're fine. The problem is if there are too many sources of histamine going into your bucket. So we have foods, those are important, but actually there's also stress, toxins, heat and cold, hormones. There is so much more that could be adding to your histamine bucket, which is why it's really important not to get too focused on the diet. Your diet might already be really low histamine and really good. It might actually be one of these other things that's causing your symptoms. So you want to look at what's putting the histamine into your bucket. How well is your DAO and HNMT able to degrade the histamine? And then see when do you start to experience symptoms. So when is that overflow threshold reached? And that's why it can be really hard to say, okay, you have to do this strict of a diet for this period of time, and then you will no longer have symptoms. because your bucket might be bigger or smaller than someone else's bucket. You might have more other sources of histamine or more other triggers feeding into your bucket, and your DAO and HNMT might be working differently. So like I mentioned, I have the SNP and DAO, and I actually also have a gene mutation in the HNMT gene, which means both of those genes for me are not working very well. So I need to keep my histamine levels lower because my body can't keep up if the histamine builds up too quickly, because my ability to degrade is limited by those genes. And you can also adjust. So if you know, okay, this is a really stressful day for me, that might be adding to my histamine level, then maybe on that day you'll be a bit stricter with the foods you eat. Whereas if you're really relaxed, you're on holiday, there's nothing to worry about, then maybe you don't need to be so strict. Maybe chili, some seafood, things like that will be fine for you. But that will really vary person by person. So you need to get to know your bucket and start to get that intuitive sense for how full is it? What can be added to this right now? How can I empty it? How can I help my body to empty it? And next week, when we're talking about root causes, we'll be addressing some of these things. And in week 4, when we're thinking about supplements and nutrients, we'll be thinking about what nutrients and supplements might support your DAO and HNMT to work even better. So this week, we're just focusing on the food, but I think it's really important to hold the bigger picture in mind regardless. So, like I just said, there is no answer to this. It's going to depend on you. But if right now you have a lot of histamine intolerance symptoms, that means your bucket is full. And we'll start by emptying your bucket. So during that time, you might need to follow a very strict low histamine diet. But that's not the only thing. You also need to manage stress, you need to prioritize sleep, and you need to prioritize positive interactions and relationships. Without these 3, your low histamine diet is not going to be enough. It's not going to cut it. So these 3 things need to be really part of your focus as you're starting to reduce the histamine in your diet. And that can be a bit of a vicious cycle, because reducing histamine in your diet can feel a bit stressful at first. And so as you're starting this journey, I would say don't focus too much on being 100% strict in your elimination, but start to get to know histamine. Understand, where is it found? How does it affect you? Which foods do you eat often that have a lot of histamine? What can you replace them with? And cut it down like that until you feel confident that you know histamine. And then you can have a very strict 2-week elimination period. And emptying your bucket can take about between 2 and 8 weeks. So again, in my own example, after 2 weeks, I really started to feel, okay, it's getting better. After 4 weeks, it was so much better that I could then tell which foods were my triggers. Because while your bucket is too full, you'll still find it quite hard to know which foods are triggering you, because your symptoms might be from something else you've eaten, or it's hard to tell, was it this or was it that? Was it breakfast or was it lunch, or is it a combination? But once your bucket was empty enough that you really had a bit of a break from your symptoms, it will be much easier for you to tell which foods are the triggers for you. But so you can expect between 2 and 8 weeks to empty your bucket, when you're also managing stress, prioritizing sleep, and prioritizing positive interactions and relationships. Now, if you've already done that, so if you've already followed a low histamine diet for a certain amount of time, like 2 to 8 weeks, and you've not really seen any improvements, make sure you've covered the basics. So stress, sleep, positive relationships. Those need to be covered. And what I see very often is that people have done the practical stuff. So they've cut out the histamine. They've done a really amazing job at that. They've worked really hard on that. But in the process, they've kind of become really stressed, and they've become stressed about food. They're anxious about trying new things. They haven't really had a chance to look at these other things. And what I would also say, if you haven't been diagnosed with histamine intolerance and you've been doing a low histamine diet and you haven't seen improvements, then it's maybe also worth working with a practitioner to make sure that the diagnosis is right, that you're not barking up the wrong tree with cutting out histamine. And the other thing is, you also need to be addressing root causes. So this course is not just about helping you to have a low histamine diet for the rest of your life. It's about this is how you can reduce the histamine load for you in this moment in time. And then starting from next week, we look at addressing your root causes. So we start to remove those things that mean you can't have a lot of histamine, so that by the end of your work, which won't be at the end of these 4 weeks, but say in 8 weeks, 12 weeks, sometimes 6 months, depending on the severity of your symptoms and the difficulty of addressing those root causes, you'll start to be able to have more histamine again. So there's obviously a limit to that. So not everybody can have as much histamine as everybody else. So for me, because it's my genes, there's only so much I can do. But I can have quite a varied diet. I can eat things like chocolate, bananas, fish, all these things. They're fine for me now because I've done this work and I've looked at root causes, and I've had a period where I have emptied my bucket and I got to know where's my threshold. And this is definitely something that we can talk about more in our Q&A session on Friday. So do make sure you register for that and come to that, because it's a real pleasure to kind of see you guys face to face and be able to go into things in a little bit more depth. Now, how strict do you need to be? Again, it varies from person to person. If your symptoms are currently very severe, you definitely want to have this 2-week strict elimination period. And you're going to have to choose when the best time is for that for you, because if it's now, and now is actually really stressful, then that's not going to work really, because all the stress will be making your histamine levels remain high, so you won't notice that reduction in your symptoms that you should see if you're working so hard. So find a good time for that strict elimination period. But in the meantime, get to know histamine, cut it down slowly, get a feeling for things, and then you can get strict when you feel ready. And the reason for actually having a strict period is that you want to be able to see your symptoms reduce enough that you can notice when foods are triggers. So that's the aim, right? The aim is just to be able to have this baseline of feeling good enough that when you eat a food that's your trigger, you can tell. Because if the symptoms are there all the time, you won't know, like I mentioned before. And then you'll be testing out your personal tolerance level. So how big is your bucket? How far can you go? Which foods can you eat? How much of them can you eat? And is it the same every day, or does it vary depending on how you're feeling, how healthy you are, all these kinds of things. If you want to do a really strict elimination and reintroduction regime, so if you really are looking to cut out all the foods and then reintroduce them one by one, monitoring your response, I think it's a good idea to work with someone one-to-one, because it's quite stressful, and it can be hard to keep track of as well. And this is not something that I can say, all of you cut out all these foods and then start by reintroducing this food and then wait 3 days and then reintroduce that food, because different foods will be different priorities for you. So for some of you, chocolate will be a big one to reintroduce early on. For others of you, bananas or spinach might be more important. Or you might want to try if you can handle sourdough bread. So it doesn't make sense for me to make this really strict regime for you that you then have to follow for 2 months, 3 months, because it does take a long time to be so strict. And then maybe it's foods you don't even care about, you don't even like. And again, as you notice your reactions, you'll have to slow down or speed up. So if you really want to be strict and have a strict elimination and reintroduction regime, I would recommend working one-to-one. And if you were working with me, then I would probably also recommend an intolerance test, so that we can see if there are any foods that we can know from the beginning are maybe problems for you. So, just to encourage you, research shows that following a reduced histamine diet leads to improvements in your histamine intolerance symptoms and in increased DAO production in patients with histamine intolerance. So, the work that you do doesn't just improve your symptoms, but also in your gut, it helps your body to be better able to break down histamine, which means that over time, you will probably be able to tolerate more histamine than you can at the moment. These results were seen after a median of following the histamine-reduced diet for 13 months. So this was followed for a long time, but it's the median, which means there might have been people who followed it for a much shorter time and people who followed it for a much longer time. So they do still need to do more studies on this so we can see how long it takes. But I would say, yes, you would have this initial strict period, and then you have a histamine reduced diet. You don't have a no histamine diet. So as long as you're just aware and you know your foods that trigger you, or you know the quantities that trigger you, then just having a slightly altered diet should be enough. So let's talk about shopping, storing, and cooking. I'm just going to go by categories of foods, and you'll find on your Practice Better account that there's a PDF download for this, just summarizing this for you to break it down and make it a little easier. So with fruits and vegetables, they are normally fine. So if you buy them fresh and not too ripe, they don't have a lot of high histamine, unless they're on the high histamine foods list. So like things like spinach, bananas, avocado. Try to eat them before they're too ripe. So you might want to shop a little more regularly, or just make sure, again, this is probably very individual. So for some of you, foods that are a week old are totally fine, whereas for some of you, fruits that are a week old are maybe too ripe. So test around with this. Maybe try and find local suppliers, because they tend to sell things that are in season and that haven't traveled far, so there's been less time for histamine to build up. But generally, the rule here is fresh and not too ripe. Store them in the fridge as far as you can, if there is space, of course. And if you're very sensitive, consider choosing frozen vegetables. They're just as nutritious as fresh vegetables, and they're usually frozen right after harvest, so that really limits the amount of time that histamine can build up. And you can, of course, also go for frozen berries like blueberries, blackberries, red currants, things like that. That can be a really good option if you've got enough space in your freezer. Grains and grain products, again, if they haven't been processed very much and they're dry, they don't build up a lot of histamine. Just store them in a cool, dry place. If they have been kind of processed, so they've been mixed with water and salt, then they are normally also fine. So things like dry pasta, again, you can store it in a cool, dry place. So for most of us, that will be fine, even though those products possibly are quite old. But just going back one step, if they have been mixed with things like egg, for example, because egg has protein, so amino acids, there's a higher likelihood of they're building up histamine, because there's a clue in the name. Histamine is a biogenic amine, which means there are amino acid groups. So foods that are higher in protein possibly have this risk of having higher histamine buildup. But in general, grains and grain products that are minimally processed should be okay and can just be stored in a cool, dry place. Nuts and seeds, these also build up histamine over time. So they're quite high in protein, so maybe that's what increases the risk. Also, the shell, there tends to be more histamine in the shell. So try to buy good quality products, not too close to their expiry date. That would be my tip. And again, if you've got space in your fridge, you can store those in the fridge. And I would particularly recommend storing nut butters in the fridge and seed butter. So once it's been broken down a bit and processed a bit, that's where the risk of histamine buildup is increased. So try and store those in the fridge if you can. Meat and poultry. So again, fresh, unprocessed meat builds up histamine very quickly. So you want to try and buy frozen or freeze directly after purchase. And you want to maybe see that you're buying it as close as possible to the packaged date, if you're buying unfrozen. Pork and beef are more likely to be triggers than poultry and lamb. That's because pork itself has some histamine releasing properties, like we mentioned at the beginning. And beef is generally aged for quite a long time before it's used to make it more tender. So usually like up to 18 days or more. And that's more of a problem for steak cuts. So if you're getting mincemeat very close to the packaging date and freezing it straight away, and then possibly even cooking from frozen, that might be better tolerated than if you're buying like beef strips or steak. But you can always speak to your butcher and see if they can help you and help you get the most recent meat. And if you live in a place where there are butchers, then I recommend getting freshly minced meat as well. Poultry tends to be a really good option. That one doesn't seem to build up histamine quite as fast, and lamb again is not as likely to be a trigger as pork and beef. Again, I buy all my meat and then put it in the freezer straight away, and then either defrost right before cooking or defrost while cooking. And there are some strategies that can help you with making that tasty, because I know that sometimes cooking from frozen is against all rules of culinary of the culinary schools. Or you can defrost in the fridge, but always on the day you will use the food. So try and not have it defrosted for too long. Fish and seafood, only buy frozen fish and seafood. And I would say cook from frozen as well, because it really builds up histamine much more quickly than any other food. And here I also wouldn't keep leftovers. So for example, with foods with meat or things like that, I'm quite happy and I don't have a reaction if I eat that the next day. But if I eat fish and seafood the next day, that has too much histamine. So that's where my threshold would be reached. So these I would say eat on the day. Meat and poultry maybe the next day would still be okay. If you're very sensitive though, you'll always have to store your leftovers in the freezer straight away and then defrost to eat again the next day. Now, when you're cooking from frozen, it's a good idea to steam or bake. Because the texture is nicer. So if you fry your fish from frozen, the texture is going to be very hard and chewy. But if you steam or bake, particularly if you bake inside a parcel or with a covered baking dish, the taste tends to and texture tends to stay right nice. Or you can cook the fish straight away in a kind of poaching base, and again that tends to have a much nicer texture as well. So some other tips: you want to be cautious about packaged foods, so takeaways, ready meals, things that are like pre-prepared, like sauces in jars, canned things, tin things, anything like this is probably going to have more histamine than if you buy something fresh and cook it from fresh. So your solution really is batch cooking and making things yourself. And again, that transition might take you a bit of time because you'll have to find your own patterns and habits and tricks to make that work. But again, that's something we can talk about more in the Q&A session. Be careful about additives. So anything like this is likely to mean that you're more likely to react if you have histamine intolerance. So go for purity. Choose foods that have really few ingredients, only what you would expect in that food. And if you're batch cooking and making most things yourself, this will be much less of a problem. I just kind of touched on this on the last slide, but leftovers can be a problem. Then try and freeze all your leftovers. So experiment with, can you eat something the next day, which I'm really hoping you can, but if not, freeze. And then this kind of fresh meats and fish, look at the packaging date. You want to make sure that it's as close to the packaging date as possible, or buy frozen. If you have a small freezer, it can be helpful to store your leftovers in freezer bags instead of Tupperware. So what you do is, once it's cooled down enough, you fill it into the freezer bag and then close it and then lay it flat into your freezer, and then you can stack freezer bags one on top of the other. And they'll just take very little space, kind of almost like baking trays stacked on top of each other. But for this, you do need to let your leftovers cool down because you don't want to be getting the plastic residues into your food. Now, your tasks for this week. That was, again, a whistle-stop tour. I am trying to keep these videos as short as possible so you can fit them into your day-to-day, but let me know if you want me to take it a bit slower. And write down any questions you have so that we can talk about them on Friday. Now, you'll find on your Practice Better account that there is a new questionnaire for you to do, which is called your histamine load. And that helps you to identify how much histamine is in your current diet. So it's just asking you about different foods that tend to be high in histamine and how often you eat them. And if you notice that there's certain foods that you're eating very often, make a note of them and then think about how can you reduce them going forwards. What can you replace them with? I would say print out the practical guide to a low histamine life and hang it somewhere. Those are all those storage and food shopping tips. You can take that with you these first couple of weeks to the supermarket to help you make decisions as well. And just remind yourself of it from time to time until it becomes, second nature. It's not something you have to think hard about. It's something you just intuitively know. And then download this week's meal plan and plan your meals for the coming week. So I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And I'd love it if you manage to try out some of the low histamine recipes in this week's meal plan. So you might not have the time to buy everything now, but just kind of look at it now and then think about, okay, what ingredients do you need to buy? Which recipes are you going to try? Are you going to do the whole plan? Or are you just going to pick and choose? Are there certain days where it's easier to try out new things? And then try some things out, preferably before Friday, so we can get some feedback about how you found that, how you found the process as well. All of this can be found under your Forms and Worksheets tab on Practice Better, and the downloads is just on the main page of this week's module. If you scroll down, you'll be able to see that download button for each of the handouts and the meal plan. Now, as always, these are the the references for this week. I will upload a PDF of these slides so you can download those as well. But I just wanted to show you this week's meal plan before we go on, which is here. So this is what it looks like, and you'll see that there's an introduction, so just what we're doing here, what I've talked about today. That's your list of recipes for this week. So you'll see that it starts with a shopping list, and then we've got the meal plan, and then it's each of the recipes. And it's 2 breakfast recipes, 2 snack recipes, and then the rest are mains recipes. This is your shopping list. So these are low histamine foods that you could consider buying for this week. These are the things that you'll need for this week. I haven't put quantities because some of you may be cooking for 1, some for 2, some for 4. But these are the foods that you'll need. And this is not a comprehensive low histamine shopping list. I will add a comprehensive one onto Practice Better so that you can see that as well. And then you can you can print that out, take that to the shops with you, and make up your own recipes if that's easier for you. And here's your meal plan. So you'll see for each day there's a breakfast, a lunch, a dinner, and a snack. For the first day, because you wouldn't have had time to have any leftovers, there is a lunch recipe, but for all other days it is leftovers. So test that out for this week to see how you do with the leftovers, and you may need to start freezing and then defrosting for the next day. You'll see here on Friday, it's not leftovers because it's fish stir fry, so you would have made that Friday night, and I recommend making it again fresh for Thursday night, and I recommend making it again fresh for Friday lunch. These fish recipes are usually quite quick and easy, so hopefully that's manageable, but otherwise you can just, cook some other things that you find more easy on that day. In terms of reheating the leftovers, I recommend kind of stir frying things the next day. So if you have the time, you can reheat it in the oven. You can use a microwave if you have one and you want to use that, or just kind of chop things up, throw it in a pan, stir fry it, maybe add a little extra water or coconut milk to make it a bit more creamy. But generally that's how I would recommend using the leftovers up. The recipes look like this. So you have the ingredients on the left, the directions on the right. Down here it tells you how much time it will take and how many people it serves, and if it's gluten-free, dairy-free, or vegan or vegetarian. This is vegetarian, sorry. And you'll see that most recipes are gluten-free and dairy-free, so that should be helpful. And you can always make it gluten-free as well. So in a few recipes, the things that I've used is spelt flour, because that tends to be well tolerated by people with histamine intolerance, but just replace that with oat flour if you do not tolerate gluten. So that would be my recommendation. And so they might still say gluten-free even if I've used spelt, because you can easily replace that. And then here in the corner you can see that there's some information about the recipe. So it just tells you why this recipe is helpful, what benefits it has, things like that. And in week 4, when we start to look at those special nutrients and supplements that help, you'll see that a lot of the recipes we use throughout these 3 weeks are very healing and very supportive of your body if you have a histamine intolerance. That's all for today. I hope that was helpful. I look forward to seeing you on Friday in the Q&A session. And if you have any questions in the meantime, just write to me on Practice Better. Thank you, and speak to you soon.